In 1994, the country of Rwanda, with a population of only 9 million people, suffered one of the most grotesque genocides in modern history. How can we ever forget that almost 1 million men, women, and children were massacred in just 4 months? Johnny Moore and I have visited the graves in Rwanda. We have been to the Genocide Memorial. Liberty University has played a major role in rebuilding the country of Rwanda and training trauma counselors. I remembered as Johnny and I were walking through the memorial, seeing pictures of children who had been killed. Listed were their names and ages, what they liked about school, what their hobbies were, what their interests were. And at the end, the inscriptions told how each child was killed. I could barely read the words: smashed against a building, macheted in a mother's arms, stabbed in the eyes and head. It was unimaginable. Why did the world sit back and do nothing? Why did the United Nations order their troops not to fire? Was it prejudice? Was it that we had just seen too many images of women and children with dirty faces and dust-covered bodies and torn clothes? President Bill Clinton has often said that not acting in Rwanda was one of his biggest regrets as president. And history is about to repeat itself. 17 years later, it seems as though we have forgotten the lessons we learned in Rwanda. This excerpt I read this week in the New York Times confirms this pattern that we simply cannot afford to repeat. It says, the worsening of the food crisis affecting more than 12 million people in the Horn of Africa is unacceptable and should make the world feel ashamed, the head of the UN Food Agency said this week. It is unacceptable for more than 12 million people to be at risk of starvation today. The required funding is lacking. If governments and their donor partners don't invest now, the appalling famine we are now struggling to redress will return to shame the international community yet again. The famine in Somalia is barely being covered in the news and in the media and remains virtually unknown to the public. How can such horrendous conditions be ignored? Why do we fail to act? Well, let me just share a few reasons. Reason number one is ignorance. In an interview on CNN with Anderson Cooper recently, Bono, the lead singer of the band U2 and a modern-day activist, said this compelling statement. He said, "You can blame droughts on God, but famines are man-made." Did you realize that famines, for the most part, are entirely preventable? Think about it. In the 21st century, we have more than enough modern technology. We have irrigation systems, drought-resistant crops, government systems in place to ensure crop security and fair distribution. And unlike a natural disaster, droughts are to be prepared for and anticipated in places that have been experiencing them for thousands of years. In fact, the fact that famine even exists in our day and age is a reflection on the collective failure of civilization as a whole. This famine didn't occur on its own. It was allowed to happen. It could have been prevented. Thousands of years ago, We read in the Old Testament, Joseph understood that when a famine comes, one prepares in advance. Through God's instruction, he stored up 7 years of food to meet the needs of an entire nation. And with all the advances of modern technology, have we not progressed enough in thousands of years to at least do the same to prevent millions and millions of needless deaths? Bono went on to say, people seem to prefer watching people in the high streets of London fight policemen rather than watching children in Somalia fighting for their lives. People watch stock values crumble while we think about our own sense of values tumbling. This will define who we are. This is a defining moment for us. Bono says, it is not our intentions, it is our actions, it is our priorities that define us. When we choose to remain unaware, uneducated, under-challenged, and comfortably numb, we cannot feel or see what is going on in the world. It is time that we choose to reject ignorance. The second reason is apathy. Bill Murray is a World Health Board member. He sent this confession to me in an email along with the dozens of his friends and business partners. He said, "Dear family and friends, I just realized something. For weeks now, I've watched the famine in Somalia on the news and I haven't done anything. Quite possibly one of the greatest humanitarian issues of my generation, and I've been consumed with political news and Tiger Woods' caddy. People are starving and I've done nothing. I've seen but apparently not heard. I've understood but not been moved enough to react with any assistance. Excuse me, I just can't become that person. The world constantly tries to beat me into submission, tries to get me to watch starving people without compassion, while I eat dinner with the TiVo news in front of me, waiting for the stock report and the sports. I must rise above being consumed with my own desires and my own immediate environment. How did I decide that doing nothing was an appropriate response? I am so embarrassed by my lack of action." I'll tell you how Bill responded in a few minutes. It really is remarkable. But apathy is a choice you and I make, not because we're ignorant, but usually because we have hardened our hearts to what we know will make us uncomfortable. In his book, Radical, David Platt says this: good intentions, regular worship, and even study of the Bible do not prevent blindness in us. Part of our sinful nature instinctively chooses to see what we want to see and ignore what we want to ignore. There's a third reason we fail to get involved, and that's fear. Fear motivates men to do the unthinkable, even to ignore atrocities in which we have the power to intervene. The root of prejudice itself is fear. Even as Christ followers, we carry prejudices that we may not even be aware that they exist. While you were on summer break this year, 30,000 African children died of starvation. And before you go home for Christmas break this year, 30,000 more African children will die of starvation. If 30,000 American children died during any length of time, let alone 90 short days, it would be the headlines for months on every corner of the globe. Right now, the media isn't even covering this story. You have to search on the internet to even find a word about what's going on in Somalia. Why? Why are we okay with thousands of innocent children dying and us doing nothing about it? I'll tell you why. They're African. They're Muslims. They're not as good as we are. That's what we feel, isn't it? This is a lie we cannot continue to tell ourselves. This is unacceptable, and God will not tolerate this from Christ's followers. David Eller, the president of World Concern, wrote these compelling words in a recent blog post. He said, when a child is withering away, it really doesn't matter whether the cause is drought, ignorance, or social injustice. It's a precious child that is dying. If we determine that a person is of less value because of where they were born, we have lost our humanity. What is the purpose of our freedom if not to help the powerless? We must do more than do no evil. We must do good. It is not enough to point fingers at the oppressors. We must help those who are oppressed. We must reach out to those who cannot repay us and who will never know our name. So what can we do about this? How do we overcome ignorance and apathy and fear and prejudice? 10 times in the New Testament it is said that Jesus was moved with compassion, and all 10 times occurred when he was confronted with great human need, with death, with disease, with hunger, with the plight of the homeless. And in fact, in Matthew chapter 9, we read these words, and Jesus went throughout all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the gospel to the kingdom and healing every disease and every affliction. And when he saw the crowds, he had compassion for them because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore, pray earnestly to the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into the harvest. Compassion requires action. Dr. Paul Brand, in his book, Fearfully and Wonderfully Made, says this: Jesus reached out his hand and touched the eyes of the blind, the skin of the person with leprosy, and the legs of the cripple. Jesus knew that love usually involved touching. We all know the parable of the Good Samaritan. We remember that the true neighbor in the story was the Samaritan, the one who had compassion. But we often forget the 4 words that Jesus used to end this parable. It's been said that these 4 words have the power to change the world. Jesus said to his listeners, "Go, do the same." You see, Jesus not only demonstrates that compassion is an act of love, but he reveals that we are to be a part of his labor force to reap the harvest. He involves us in his purpose by connecting us with one another, showing us that what we have in common is far stronger than the things that we have that make us different. While I was in Kenya last week, I was accompanied by several other team members from World Help. Our Director of Humanitarian Aid, Jesse West, who's attended Liberty, wrote about his experiences in his journal. He said, we met a woman who had just completed the journey from Mogadishu to Dadaab, 370 miles. The woman had a child strapped to her front and back. They were twins. They were no older than a few months. Their hair was a red hue and an indication that their bodies were malnourished. What stood out the most about the children was their little feet. They looked like those of my son Corbett. All the tiny little wrinkles, no calluses because they hadn't learned to walk. The sad reality is that these children will never learn to walk. This was just two of the little babies in a camp of tens of thousands. Yet even with all the children at Dadaab, I only heard the cries of a child twice that day. I've heard it said, it's not the crying child that's the most desperate, but the child that does not cry because he or she is too weak. Neither of the twins cried. Neither child held his head aloft. They simply, sadly, hung on their desperate mother, who herself was malnourished. The first step of confession is connecting with other human beings. Jesse found this connection through the common thread of his own son and the children he saw. He was moved with compassion, and then he was able to act on what he knew was unacceptable for him to ignore. Through Jesse's help, we plan to send nearly 5 million meals to this area in the coming days. While I was in Dadaab, I spoke with several women who told me that they, along with hundreds of other women, had been beaten and brutally raped by the police while crossing the Kenyan border. I soon learned that this was happening to nearly every woman who was crossing the border. One aid worker said it this way: 2 weeks ago, I sat in a thatched roofed hut outside Hagadera speaking with a group of Somali women who had just crossed one of the most dangerous borders in the world. Their stories were alarming and disturbingly similar. Women and girls were taken from overcrowded vehicles, then robbed and raped by men with guns. Many were raped by multiple attackers, sometimes in front of their own families. Some came to the camp naked. Many don't come forward either because of shame and fear. News like this makes us want to act because our hearts long for justice, and our heart goes out to the pain of these women. We hurt because we know how much the women in our own lives mean to us. And all of a sudden we are appalled by the thought of just standing idly by. True compassion moves us to action. There were a few moments I spent in the hospital in Dadaab solidified in my own mind that there was no other option than to do everything I could for the Somali people. The hospital, which was nothing more than a ramshackle of tents and some cots, 190 children were dying from malnutrition and measles and preventable diseases. There were as many as 50 children in one room along with their mothers and nursing babies. When I spoke to the doctor, he confirmed the statistic that in the last 90 days, 30,000 children had died. And he said 10% of the children under the age of 5 are dying every 11 weeks. At this rate, an entire generation of Somali children will be wiped out before we even know it. As I walked to the back of one of the hospital wards where I saw a little boy about the same age as one of my grandsons. He was suffering from the final stages of malnutrition and was only moments away from taking his last breath. Out of respect for his family, we did not take any photographs. But I will never forget that sight. There was nothing more that the doctors could do. He was too far gone. What I saw in those brief minutes has quickly become one of the saddest moments in my life. In the book of Amos, the Bible speaks about justice and just how much God longs for it, even more than our good intentions. In Amos chapter 5, the Message translation says this: I can't stand your religious meetings. I'm fed up with your conferences and conventions. I want nothing to do with your religion projects, your pretentious slogans and goals. I'm sick of your fundraising schemes, your public relations and image making. I've had all I can take of your noisy ego music. When was the last time you sang to me, do you know what I want? I want justice. Oceans of it. I want fairness, rivers of it. That's what I want. That's all I want. Eugene Peterson has said that justice is a serious gospel prophetic mandate. Far too many Christians for far too long have left the cause to others. Justice is important to God because it reflects his character. Tim Keller, the author of Generous Justice, says, God loves and defends those with the least economic and social power, and so should we. Remember my friend Bill Murray, the one who was embarrassed by his initial lack of action? Well, Bill has done battle with his own apathy in a way that is impacting the lives of thousands in both Somalia and even in his own backyard. Inspiring and empowering those around him, Bill has raised $14,000 to cover the cost of 2 containers of food being sent to Somali refugees, nearly 500,000 meals. And because of people like Bill, World Help is sending 20 containers in the next few days and $12.5 million of medicine. And we are not stopping there. With each container only costs $6,000 to ship, we plan to send as many as we can fund. People like Bill Murray, that's compassion in action. As Americans, we're used to seeing television images of distressed children in need of help. It's easy to become hardened because of the sheer magnitude of these realities. After all, we don't know any of these children. Why should we be responsible? They're just strangers anyway. Liberty students, faculty, staff, I've come here today to ask you to choose to wage battle on our collective tendency to be paralyzed by indifference and ignorance and even the best of intentions. And one practical way of doing this is to start by finding a problem that you are passionate about solving. One of your fellow classmates this morning, Cassie Foster, who is a freshman, is selling Cause Life bracelets like the one I'm wearing up in section 102 in order to raise money for a well at the Dadaab camp in East Africa, the very place that needs clean water more than any place in the world right now. And Cassie is passionate about this cause. She has found her heartbeat. She went after it. And I invite you to please stop by her table, buy a bracelet, and get involved. What about you? Are you interested in providing clean water, for caring for orphans, teaching children how to read or write? Do you want to see churches built? What about widows being protected? Perhaps you see the evils of human trafficking and want to dedicate your life to stopping it. Whatever your passion is, God has a place in this world for you to use it for good, to accomplish his purposes. And I encourage you today, don't make a commitment in your mind and heart that you don't plan to turn into action. Act first, and the commitment will follow as a result. Take a risk. You've already heard that this year, every one of you has an opportunity to get out of your comfort zone and to go on one of the many Liberty University short-term mission trips and take some risks for God. You'll have the opportunity to test your faith by raising your support. But don't worry, where God guides, God provides. You'll visit countries where there's so much hurt and so much need. Places like India and Bosnia and Ecuador and the Middle East and Nepal and Brazil. I implore you to at least go to the information meeting next Monday night at the Schilling Center at 7 o'clock. Can you imagine? Can you just imagine what God could do if hundreds of students in this room today would say, that's the very least I can do to get involved? Just imagine. Just one person in this arena took that risk, raised their support, took a step of faith. Just imagine if while they were there, God spoke to them like He spoke to me last week in Africa. Just imagine if that student spent the rest of their life fulfilling the Great Commission and God's vision for their life. Just imagine if millions of new Christ followers came to faith because of that one student's passion. And just imagine if that one student was you. Just imagine. Thank you.